Thank you, Phil, for the honor of inviting me here. I'd like to say hello to all my Australian colleagues. I think it's about the wee hours of tomorrow morning for you. So if you fall asleep, I really don't mind. And to my South African and Mediterranean Basin colleagues, it's happy time for you. You know, you're just about sitting down to have a drink. So if you start getting fidgety, I don't mind. To my Chilean colleagues, I think it's just about lunchtime for you. So you might also be feeling a bit grumpy. I don't mind. But for the Californians, who are the majority, you better damn well listen to me. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the evolution of Mediterranean ecosystems, take us back to some of the things that Hel was talking about. Last September, a bunch of us, a bunch of scabangas, tsotsis, whatever you want to call us, got together in South Africa in September. As I said, it included some old guys, but also some young people, and we had a little workshop about figuring out about what is the role of the idiosyncrasies of histories on the evolution of Mediterranean ecosystems. So we went back to some of those old themes. Now, I hope I get this right. Yeah. So I don't need to explain that to you guys. These are the Mediterranean climate ecosystems of the world. There's been a long and enduring interest in them. And they're hotspots. Okay, they're recognized by Conservation International as biological hotspots. They attract a lot of conservation investment. This is just a standard species area curve. The red blobs are the Mediterranean ones, and you can see they're mixed in with tropical hotspots in terms of their species area relations. And that's a great challenge, which is a bit of an aside to ecological theory, because, you know, we hear a lot about species energy theory. Now we're talking about systems where the energy periods are during the dry time of the year, and yet they've got all of these species, which is challenges the theory quite a bit. You see there's also a kind of a ranking there. The Cape always sits right at the top, followed by Australia, Mediterranean Basin. We've chosen the Iberian Peninsula for focus of this talk because most of it is Mediterranean climate, and you can get good floras for it. And I'm also talking mainly about plants. I'm sorry, I would love to talk about chojos and other sorts of things, but the focus here is on plants. And then California and Chile at the bottom. There's a kind of a ranking, and you'll see that emerging again. If we look at number of endemic species, again, these areas have heaps of endemic species, analogous or very similar to what you're going to find in tropical ecosystems. So they're really important areas globally in terms of their biodiversity, and certainly up there with tropical ecosystems. So the guy who fired me up was Schimper. Schimper wrote a book called Plant Physiology Upon a Geographical Basis, and he also put out this question, you know, these Mediterranean climate ecosystems, irrespective of their different phylogenetic roots, should have similar structures and functions. And that was in the end of the 19th century. And then there was Uncle Ray Specht. I think, Hel, I may be wrong, but he might have published one of the first comparative papers back in 1969. And Uncle Ray Specht really left us a great legacy, because he said, hey, wait, hang on, guys, it's not just climate, it's also nutrients. He came from that sort of geologically worn-down continent called Australia, where almost everywhere is infertile, and so he saw the nutrient link straight away. And of course, Uncle Hel, can I call you Uncle Hel? Uncle Hel Mooney, who has done an enormous service to the Mediterranean community, and as he showed us before, played the key role, I think the absolute key role in getting the ball rolling with comparative studies across Mediterranean climate regions. And that was way back in the 1970s, before some of you young people here were probably even born. Okay, and he published a paper, series of papers coming out of that period, comparing vegetation along similar climatic gradients in California and in Chile. And climate was regarded as a very important selective force. And then my first paper, actually, was published in 1980. And we took the gradients from California and Chile and replicated them in the Cape. And hey presto, things didn't work so well because of the overriding role of nutrients. What we found was that small leaf size persisted along the gradient. We didn't find any deciduous plants. Down at the bottom of the gradient, we found heaps and heaps of leaf succulents. And Phil and Karen Essler and others got interested in that issue later on. So there was something going on with the Cape, and certainly our argument at this stage was that it had a hang of a lot to do with nutrients. So we were supporting what Uncle Ray had said much earlier. So really you could look at Mediterranean ecosystems in terms of their different nutrient contents, with way down at the bottom, the Cape in Australia being very low in soil nitrogen and phosphorus, Mediterranean basin, predominantly calcareous soils, being somewhat intermediate, and California and Chile, these recently uplifted landscapes with lots of volcanics and what have you, with generally much richer soils. And then I went to Australia under the curatorship of the famous Byron Lamont, and one of the sideshows there was to work with a character called Tony Malevsky. You can see he's up in the far right-hand corner there, real crazy guy. And he had discovered down in the southwestern corner of Western Australia a landscape that looked so similar to the Cape, you almost had to pinch yourself to say, my goodness, where am I? And we looked at a number of similar habitats, different soil types in these two areas, and found remarkable convergence in terms of community structure, species turnover, fire-adapted traits, and so on and so forth. And so here we were pulling together similar climates, similar soils, similar fire regimes, and similar histories. And I stress that word, I'm going to pick it up later on, similar histories, and phew, you really got very strong convergence patterns. So we can look at these systems in a different way, the way perhaps Uncle Ray would have looked at them. The Chile, the Mediterranean basin in California were shrublands, nutrient-rich soils, Mediterranean climates, and Cape and southwestern Australia were Mediterranean-type heathlands. And that was a kind of thinking that was around in the 1980s, and I think that meeting in South Africa pushed a lot of that stuff. Everybody sort of became focused obsessively in some ways on nutrients. And indeed, when you go to areas of the Mediterranean basin that's a younger climate, like around Gibraltar in Spain, but you find nutrient-poor soils, you find very strong similarities between that and the Cape in a whole array of community structures. So this nutrient story was looking very, very strong. But this other major issue, of course, is fire. And these Mediterranean climate regions have different fire regimes, and of the Cape tended to have, and Australia tended to have similar climate, similar types of fire regimes, California and the Mediterranean basin, longer intervals. Fires are a really important aspect of Mediterranean climate regions, lots of fire-adapted traits. I know some of our colleagues in our group would probably disagree with us, but certainly if you look at the Australian and Cape floras, huge evidence of fire-adapted traits. Yet Chile was different. Chile hadn't had fire. And so you could get landscapes like this in Chile with huge fire-sensitive cacti. And what they looked like were the subtropical thickets that occur in the eastern part of the Cape region, which have a diversity of extremely ancient lineages. So Chile, again, was the odd man out in terms of not experiencing fire. Also looking at climate, this diagram, we see winter rainfall on the bottom axis and coefficient of variation of the winter rainfall, the winter half of rainfall on the side axis. And again, some sort of clustering occurs. What we see at the top are the Mediterranean basin, California, where the amount of rain that falls is highly unpredictable from year to year and tends to fall in a lot of large events. At the bottom, we see Australia and the Cape and Chile, where the amount of rain is very predictable, much more predictable. And we certainly know for Australia and the Cape, tends to fall in a lot of small events. For Chile, we don't yet have the data, and I'd like to learn from my Chilean colleagues what goes on there. And if we look at the summer quarter of rain, we have Mediterranean Basin, California, and Chile that get very little rain in summer. The summers are very drought-stressed. And then Australia and South Africa that gets quite a bit of summer rain, and that rain is reasonably predictable. And this, of course, has huge consequences for post-fire recruitment patterns, you know, the favorability or predictability of particular environments for insect life cycles and so on and so forth. Okay, now moving on to topography. It's something that, you know, we've always kind of spoken about and yet not really done any very serious analyses. And this is data that's fresh out of the computer, and we haven't really done a huge amount. But what you can see here are profiles for the various Mediterranean regions running east-west or west-east across them. These are transects of 3 transects of 70 kilometers wide, averaged. And it's quite clear, and we all know that Chile, California, and the Mediterranean basin have massive topography, huge changes in relief, but also great variation. So the standard deviations at any particular area are very high, indicating high topographic diversity. Australia, on the other hand, is dead flat. It's boring. You can drive for miles and nothing happens. And the Cape has what Daniel Axelrod said once when he stepped out onto the tarmac at the airport in Cape Town. He said, "That's not mountains, those are hills." But the Cape has reasonable mountains that have very high relief, and actually the heterogeneity is reasonably high for the Cape. Now, this is one of the measure of diversity that I think gives us the best kind of ranking. These are patterns of regional richness. So at the bottom we have log area. On the side axis we have log species, and these are for different regions of different sizes. So you've sampled areas from, you know, maybe a couple of square kilometers up to, you know, 50,000 square kilometers. This was published some time ago. The important thing is the message to take from this diagram is the ranking. So the Cape has about 1.8 as many times as Australia on average. It has about twice as many times as the Mediterranean Basin or California, and 3 times as many species as Chile. So again, that kind of ranking, Cape, then Australia, then California, Mediterranean Basin, and Chile way down at the bottom is indicated in this kind of analysis, which I think is probably the best way to depict these diversity patterns. So we can look at these Mediterranean basins again in a different way. The Cape being the hottest hotspot of biodiversity, Australia a little dimmer, the Mediterranean basin in California even a little more dimmer, and then finally Chile, the least species rich of them all. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about the contemporary environments, but we all know that history is important, and the idiosyncrasies of history can play a hugely important role on the evolution of biodiversity in a particular area. So now we're going to have a look at some of the historical differences amongst these regions and develop some ideas of what impacts this could have on speciation and extinction rates. So I'm going to ask you just to get your head around this rather complex diagram. On the bottom we have time. We have the various geological periods above, and we're really interested in the period. Is there a pointer on this thing? Ah, wonderful. We're interested in the period really from the Oligocene through to the Pleistocene. And we know that in the end of the Eocene, the Eocene was an extremely warm period, warmest, wettest period virtually on record. And then during the Oligocene, things got cooler and drier. There was a mid-Miocene warm period, and then this downward spiral of increasingly cooler and drier conditions into the Pleistocene. So we're going to look more or less over this period. We know that Mediterranean climates evolved started developing sometime in the mid-Miocene, and were fully happening by about the middle of the Pliocene. Let's have a look at how the topographies of these areas have changed over time. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the different Mediterranean climate regions. The brown line is a kind of a reconstruction of what the landscape looked like in the Oligocene, towards the end of the Oligocene, about 25 million years ago. The green line is what it looked like in the mid-Miocene, when the Mediterranean climate started evolving. If we have a look at California, what's absolutely clear is that most of what is the Californian Mediterranean climate region now didn't exist in the mid-Miocene. So it's a very young landscape. The same really applies to Spain. Again, in the late Oligocene, there's a little bump there, a bit more land exposed, and again for Chile. So a lot of what a Mediterranean, the landscape that we see as Mediterranean climate landscape today, hardly existed when the Mediterranean climate developed. But if we go to our southern hemisphere, old Gondwanan bits, in the Cape, we see that there have been some uplift. There have been 2 uplift events, relatively minor. I'll explain later that they've been pretty important in terms of changing landscapes and enhancing speciation. And on Australia, sweet nothing has happened. So for the last 50 million, 100 million years, the slab of land has just sat there slowly weathering away and disappearing. So in Australia, what we have is an extremely ancient landscape. Here is a bit of old laterite surface that was once global, and there are bits of it in South Africa. And there's a breakaway and a sand plain there. And although there's no topography there, the composition of the species probably turns over a couple of times from the top of this mesa down into the sand. So huge numbers of species are packed into a landscape that really is as dull as you can imagine. And then here in the Cape, we have the hills there in the background. Here is this old landscape that's analogous to this one here. There's been uplift, and that uplift has been very important because it's stripped off the sand plains, and it's stripped the siltcretes and laterites and exposed young soils, a whole lot of young shale-rich soils. And this landscape the transformation in it was pretty much complete by the Pliocene, just when that Mediterranean climate was really beginning to click in. So the combination of this exposure of these new environments and the development of the Mediterranean climate was really quite a special event in terms of Cape diversification. So all of these new vegetation types, new biomes like Renosterveld, which is more similar to chaparral in many ways, are pretty recent phenomena and associated with huge amounts of recent diversification. But on the mountains sit a lot of the old lineages going back tens of millions of years. And then we have the 3 recent landscapes. We have Spain, California, and Chile, which, as Phil reminded us today, are still active. They're still doing things. So they're uplifting. The soils haven't had time to sort of settle down, so dafic differentiation isn't as marked as is in Australia and in the Cape. Looking at climate change, this is the results of some climate modeling done by Pete Bradshaw, who's in the audience here, so if you want to ask any questions about this, get hold of him. So what we have is the contemporary climate. This is an example of a climate that's remained very stable. Okay, we have the contemporary climate, Mediterranean climate, characterized in terms of the old Köppen classification, which works pretty damn well. Here we have the climate at 21,000 years ago, which is the height of the last glacial. And we can see it remains pretty stable. It expands slightly, and here we have it with a different model. Okay, so these are two different climate models that we used. And you can see, by and large, the Mediterranean climate remains stable and, if not expanded. When we look at Chile, and these three panels are the same as here, we see that there's a marked retraction in the area of Mediterranean climate. So it retracted, pushed in the south probably by rainforests, and held in check in the north by desert climates. So Chile was much less stable. So if we summarize these data, this is just the change in the area of Mediterranean climate over the glacial present cycle. We can see that, and this is the average, and these are the results of the two models. Let's just focus on the average. Basically, on Australia, virtually no change. In the Cape, a slight increase, and in the other three areas, sorry, not no change, huge increases, and then the other three areas declines in the extent of Mediterranean climate. So much less stability in Chile. Med here stands for Iberia, and that stands for the whole Mediterranean basin, and that's California there. Excuse these slides, but this stuff was cranked out just before we left. And this gives us some idea of the refugial effect. So the extent to which areas that are currently Mediterranean were Mediterranean in the past. What was the overlap? And again, we see a pattern for Australia and the Cape, much less, a lot of overlap between what was Mediterranean now, what is Mediterranean now and what changed in the past, and much less so for all of the other areas. Okay, so if we just summarize this, how's my time full? Okay. 5, brilliant. I'll be finished before then. If we summarize this, okay, here we have the different Mediterranean climate regions. Here we have a scale, just for convenience, set at 5, but the way in which things are scaled is not just a ranking system. And if we look at diversity, we see the Cape way up there, next Australia, California, the Iberian Peninsula, very similar, and Chile down there. If we look at contemporary heterogeneity, the amount in which the landscape changes and so on, the Cape, modest heterogeneity, Australia, none, very high heterogeneity in the other three regions. There's no real link between heterogeneity and contemporary diversity. If we bring climatic stability into it, the Cape and Australia having high climatic stability, and the other areas having very low climatic stability. There seems to be a link between climatic stability and topo stability. Again, Australia having the highest, the Cape less so, and very low topo stability in the other regions. So generally, the Mediterranean basin, California and Chile have had low topo stability, low climatic stability, and generally have low diversity. The Cape has had a moderate amount of stability, moderate amount of topographic instability, and maybe it's just the right amount of uplift to generate diversification. Australia, on the other hand, has had very low topographic stability, which may have acted as a constraint upon diversification in this region. So we can get back to our Mediterranean climate regions and use Steve Hopper's classification of landscapes, in which case the Australia would be an old, climatically buffered, infertile landscape, an Ockbill. And the Cape would be an old, climatically buffered, infertile landscape, but importantly, it also has aspects of a young, disturbed, fertile landscape, a Jodfell. And then if we look at the others, they're all Jodfells. So maybe it's the Ockbull-Yodfell combination that makes the Cape special. Okay, so now we're looking at the phylogenies from all of these areas to test some predictions about what we would expect on the basis of the evolutionary, of the environmental histories of these different regions. And our colleagues Felix Forrest and Rion Smith are busy working on this now. We're getting some preliminary results. And what I'm going to do is just close by summarizing what we would expect. So in the Cape, we would expect low extinction. There's been landscapes there really ancient and been stable. And a lot of speciation. There's been the right amount of stability. So you've had that little bit of uplift that has exposed new landscapes and enabled a whole lot of lineages to diversify, the mesems, a lot of the bulbs, and so on and so forth. Australia, low extinction and moderate speciation. Maybe there's evidence of saturation there. Maybe in some of the lineages, rates of speciation are actually slowing down like they are in the proteas of South Africa. They've just kind of saturated the habitats where they are constrained to colonize. California, Mediterranean, high extinction and moderate recent speciation. There's been low stability. And Chile, phew, I don't know. Low extinction and low speciation. Maybe it's the absence of fire. Thank you very much, everybody.